Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to the latest episode in our new series, Call My Supervisor, the PhD podcast for the School of Politics and Economics at King's College London. In each episode, we will be speaking to a doctoral candidate from one of our departments to pick their brains about all things PhD, from their research and ideas to their revelations and advice. We hope to offer a platform for those studying with us to showcase their work, while offering invaluable insight into what life is like studying to become a doctor. If nothing else, we hope you finish up today having learned something you didn't know when you started it. My name is Daniel Mansfield, and I am the Communications Officer for the School of Politics and Economics here at King's College. And I'm pleased to introduce you today to my co-host for this episode, Tomek Gola, a final year undergraduate studying European politics. Hi, Tomek.
Hi, everyone.
And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest for this episode, Anri Sakakibara, a doctoral candidate studying with the Department of Political Economy. Welcome, Anri.
Hi.
Good stuff. So we are going to make a start. And for the first question, Anri, I'm going to ask you, please, for the title of your project and a brief introduction.
So my title is on structural transformation and labor in Vietnam. So what's referred to as structural transformation in economics is when workers move from the agricultural into the manufacturing sector. So I look at what happens when women, female workers specifically, move from the agricultural to the manufacturing sector in three different forms. So whether they upskill or not, whether the spousal wage gap decreases or not, and also whether maternity benefits induce a structural transformation or not.
That's great. And would you tell us as well what kind of research you employ in more detail? So what kind of methods that would entail on your research side?
So I mainly use quantitative methods. I don't do qualitative methods. I don't do interviews. Instead, what I use is observational data collected by the General Statistics Office of Vietnam, and then use econometric methods to draw conclusions. So mainly what that involves is building a model and then running regressions and then interpreting the values.
So this is quite a specific area of study about quite a specific set of circumstances. So I wonder if you can tell us why you chose this area.
So I actually grew up in Vietnam. My mum is Vietnamese, and growing up, I've always been very fascinated by how rapidly Vietnam changed as a country. It's one of the fastest developing countries in the world, and I was able to experience that firsthand. And that really inspired me to do a PhD where I could study, the drivers of change that I was seeing happen around me. But more importantly, what was happening concurrently or as a result of this change on women's empowerment at the household, at the firm level, and also at the sector level.
Okay, so what, in terms of female empowerment and change, even over the course of your lifetime, have you noticed changes, shifts that have come with the development of the country?
Yeah, so in Vietnam, female labor force participation has always been very high. So the outcomes I'm looking at aren't strictly in terms of female labor force participation. It's more about skills. It's more about whether women are able to negotiate with their husbands at a higher bargaining position. And it's also about whether the quality of jobs that women have and how that impacts her household level empowerment. So more in terms of things like whether women are able to command a higher level of decision-making process when it comes to how household resources are allocated. In terms of more, norms and values and whether I've seen a shift in that, it's incredibly hard to say. I think I grew up in an environment where the women in my life have always been very strong, very, very fiery, very feisty, very bossy. But I'm hesitant to extrapolate from that and make wider comments. I do look at norms and values as part of my PhD, using World Values Survey. I actually find that there hasn't been a big shift in norms and values, but that's not to say norms and values haven't shifted. It might be because the data hasn't captured that, and that's one of the limitations of using only quantitative methods.
Okay, and just finally, I'll jump in there before I hand back to Tomek. Is your study looking at a specific region of Vietnam? Are you looking at just rural areas? Are you looking at cities, or is it the entire country?
So I use data from the General Statistics Office, and I have household level data, and I also have labour force data, and that's nationally representative. But as part of my analysis, I also look at what economists refer to as heterogeneous effects. So whether policies affect different groups differently. And one of the variables, heterogeneous effects I look at, is urban and rural. So whether rural workers are reallocating more or less than urban workers into the manufacturing sector.
That's actually a great turn now into a question that we have on data. So you mentioned you're using data from the National Statistical Office. It sounds like the data you're using is very detailed and very sort of covers a very broad range of aspects. I was wondering, do you expect to need to travel or do any sort of primary research at all, or is that data going to cover sort of your question?
Yeah, so it mainly covers the questions I want to answer. I think in the future I would like to be able to do some field work, but given, the financial constraints and also the time constraints of my PhD, I'll be relying on observational data.
The people we've spoken to, the PhD candidates we've spoken to over the course of this series, they've been at various stages of their project, and they've expected to take, certain amounts of time to get it done. Where would you say you are, and how far along do you think you are now in terms of where you want to be?
So I'm in my third year now, and I would say that I hope to be entering into writing up in 6 months' time, and then finishing summer 2024. So I have a first draft of my first chapter. I have a first draft of my second chapter. I'm now working on my third chapter. But with each chapter, I found that the process becomes faster. So even though it's technically taken me 2 years to finish my first chapter, it's taken me half that amount of time for my second chapter. And I don't want to say it's going to take me 6 months for my third chapter, but it means that there's an economies of scale, and the skills I've learned from my first and second chapter, I'll be able to apply to my third chapter.
Okay, and can you break down, for someone who knows nothing about the process, can you break down how yours is made up, how your project is made up? You mentioned chapters there. Is it like chapter 1, here's my premise, chapter 2, here's my data, chapter 3, here's my interpretation? How does your project work?
Because I'm using quantitative methods, my PhD could be thematic, and I could have 3 completely distinct papers, which are referred to as chapters. But they're not like chapters in a book. They're a chapter in your PhD thesis, but they're actually standalone papers. So the broad theme of my PhD is structural transformation and female labour market outcomes. But my first chapter is on how a bilateral trade agreement between the US and Vietnam allowed women to move from the agricultural to the manufacturing sector, and how that affected the spousal wage gap. The second chapter is on how the Trump trade war with China had an inadvertent effect on the Vietnamese labour force, and how that allowed women to move from the agricultural into the manufacturing sector, and also attain higher skilled jobs, work longer hours, and also increase wages as a result of that. My third chapter is not so much demand side, it's more supply side. So it's not how market demands increase female workers in the labour force, it's more supply side. So what are the factors that are causing women to enter the workforce in the first place? So I look at how extensions in maternity leave policy cause women to reallocate from the informal to the formal sector and from the agricultural into the manufacturing sector, because these are the sectors that are actually providing maternity leave benefits, and not the former.
Could you already say what kind of surprised you in your research, as it seems like you're quite far along? Have there been anything that particularly stood out for you?
What surprised me was how long data cleaning would take. So I didn't expect to be just cleaning data for 6 months. I thought, once I acquired the data, I could start implementing my models immediately, but that was not the case. The data you get from the statistics office is usually incredibly messy. Another complication of my data was that I had panel data, which means that I can track individuals and households over the course of 5 years. And I received 3 separate data sets representing, 2002, 2004, and 2006. And I had to code individuals and households in such a way that I could link the same individuals, to separate data sets. And that took a really, really long time. And I didn't expect, the logistics of the PhD to take so much time. I thought it would be much more straightforward than that.
Right. It's very interesting how we've been hearing from many PhD candidates that much of the work is admin, like in any other job. So it sounds like for you, cleaning out the data was that admin bit. And just a quick follow-up. So you say you received data sets from the office. Did you have to request that, or are they like readily available on their websites?
So yeah, that was another piece of admin that took a really long time. That was unexpected. So it took about 6 months for me to get the data from the General Statistics Office, and so no, I can't just download that from the website. Number one, I had to secure funding to buy the data. It's incredibly expensive, so that took time. Secondly, I had to put in a formal request. It took time for that to become approved, and then I had to go through the King's finance just to make sure that I wasn't embezzling the funds, and I was actually going towards the General Statistics Office. But it's always complicated when you're buying data from a different country, because sending money abroad is is a bit risky.
These are all unexpected bits and pieces, aren't they? Transferring money and contacting government authorities and all that, and learning coding as well. Did you have to do some of that?
Yeah, so I knew how to use R before I started my PhD, but it was more in a classroom context, and I never had raw data to play with. It was, the data was cleaned for me by the TAs and by the lecturers, so that we could get on with implementing the model. So a lot of the PhD was learning how to code to clean data, but it's a useful skill to have. And which has also meant that my second and third chapter, I'm spending less time Googling or asking people on Stack Overflow how to do something. I now know how to do it.
We were speaking to Lena Kramer for a previous episode. You probably know Lena.
Yeah.
And she had to teach herself Python from scratch. I don't know, are you using Python, or are you using HTML, or?
So I tried to learn Python, but I couldn't even get past how to download Python, which is really embarrassing. But I knew R, and I really like R, and everybody in the office knows how much I like R, because that's basically all I talk about. But I knew R, so I didn't have to teach myself a new language, luckily. But the problem with R is that it's an open source software. So there's no such thing as R language. So you download packages and then you learn the language of that package. But luckily that wasn't too difficult.
It sounds tremendously difficult, in fairness. So kudos to you for going through that process. I just had another question. So has your project changed from 3 years ago to now? So at the inception, did you have a different idea and the journey has taken you in a change of direction, or has it been consistent from the outset?
Absolutely. So I remember the research proposal that I submitted when I was applying to do a PhD at King's, and it was on whether trade improved or trade reduced poverty in Vietnam. And within 2 weeks of entering the program, I knew that trade and poverty alleviation is a question that has been answered in so many different forms, and that my contribution to the literature would be very, very minimal. And also my research interests have changed because I realized that it wasn't really poverty reduction. It like that wasn't a specific enough question that I wanted to tackle. It was really individual level poverty at the household. So even if we find that households get richer, individuals within the household can still remain poor because household resources aren't allocated evenly. So a question I wanted to answer was whether trade alleviated individual level poverty at the household level. And that's why I came up with the research question, which was whether trade reduced the spousal wage gap. Because then what I'm measuring is whether women's poverty within her household has increased or decreased as a result of trade.
And do you work on that remodeling with your supervisor or supervisors, or do they nudge you and say, what do you think about this angle, or does that occur to you as you're going?
So within my first year, I say this to a lot of people and they're very surprised by that, but I actually didn't do any writing. My first year was me just reading lots and lots of articles, kind of from a wide range of topics. So development, trade, but also some sociological materials as well. And then trying to see if I could, combine disciplines together, research questions together, and a topic I found really interesting to read throughout was the intra-household bargaining literature. So this is completely separate from the trade literature, and intra-household bargaining literature looks at what happens if you randomly give women money, but not their husbands, and see how household consumption of household goods change as a result of giving just one partner the money. Because if we think traditionally of the household model, if you give one person money, it doesn't matter which spouse you give it to. If a household maximizes utility at the household level, it doesn't matter which one you give it to, the outcome should be the same. But lots of studies actually find that if you give women the money and not the husbands the money, spending on education and nutritious food and health increases. But if you give men the money, spending on tobacco and alcohol increases, and not education and not health. So I was really fascinated by this, and I knew that in the context of Vietnam, structural transformation occurred in such a way that it was women reallocating into higher paid sectors and not men as a result of the trade agreement. So I thought, well, that would be quite interesting to combine the two together and see what happens when, in my scenario, I'm not randomly giving women money. In this scenario, it's still kind of the same mechanism, which is closing the pay gap between spouses. If I move women from the agriculture into the manufacturing sector and the spousal wage gap closes, what happens to the household consumption of goods? And I find that actually there's no changes in household consumption of goods, even though the spousal wage gap closed.
Intra-household bargaining, that's called.
Yes, yeah.
Fascinating. It sounds. Were those findings you mentioned, are they specific to Vietnam, or are they sort of global level?
So the context I study is Vietnam, but I think I can extrapolate lessons from that. So the spousal wage gap did close, and it closed considerably. So I find that women increased their contribution to the household income by about 8 percentage points, which is massive. But it's from a very low level, so from 22% to say 30% of the total household income. And that might be the reason why we haven't been able to see massive changes. It might be different if you're women are going from 20 to 50%. And then that's where we would see significant changes. But I also look at, like I said, values and norms, and they haven't really shifted that much. And that means that one of, an important transmission mechanism that we're not looking at, that's often been ignored in the intra-household bargaining literature, is the role of values and norms, and not just money.
And if I can just backtrack a bit to when you were talking about having to learn R and other methods. Was this something that you could also rely on for training here at King's or from your supervisor? Or was this sort of also a bit solitary as your refinements of the general topic?
So I would say my supervisors were very, very helpful in kind of signaling what I should be reading, and whether, because I had a bunch of crazy ideas when I first started, and guiding me in saying what was feasible and what wasn't, whether certain ideas I should just write off from the start. And I really appreciated that. But in terms of coding, so my supervisors actually use Stata and I use R. So in terms of skilling up in terms of code, I kind of had to do that myself, but luckily the internet exists. Stack Overflow exists. Which means I got a lot of help from my friends on the internet.
Look, Chat GPT-4's coming, so eventually it'll just be able to do it all for you, will it?
Yeah, so I've seen lots of Twitter threads that talks that says that if you put a Stata command in, Chat GPT can write the R equivalent to that, which is a game changer.
All your troubles are at an end, honestly.
Yes, yeah.
Good stuff. Well, in that case, then we will call it an end to part one. And we thank you very much. We'll take a short break here and we will come back in a moment for part two.
In this part of the podcast, we're speaking to a scholar who previously to joining academia has undertaken a professional career. Joining us is Dr. Marc Berenson, a senior lecturer at the King's Russia Institute. Prior to undertaking his PhD in political science at Princeton University, Dr. Berenson funded and directed the Law in Action program for Freedom House in Kiev from 1996 to 1998, which we will be probably most interested to hear about. Welcome to the podcast, Marc. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Great to be here as well. Thanks, Thomas.
Okay, let's start with the questions then. We would be very curious, most of all, to hear why did you decide to go back into university after you've worked in other areas?
I decided to go back because I was really curious to learn more about the whys of what was going on around me. And I found it fascinating, desirable to live and work in the former Soviet Union, specifically Kyiv. And it was a very challenging time for practically all Ukrainians and all people in the former Soviet Union, as the 1990s were a period of great deprivation, great hardship, and a worse sort of depression than what we in the West went through in the 1930s. And I wanted to, I also was under the sort of, I'd gone into this field a few years before, having graduated high school in 1989. The whole world of Eastern Europe was opening up. I like to tell my students that given that my favorite movie is The Graduate with Dustin Hoffman and Anne Bancroft and Catherine Ross, the beginning of that movie, Dustin Hoffman plays a college graduate who comes home to his parents' house in Pasadena, California. It's 1967. One of his father's friends says to him, "I have one word for your future: plastics." Well, for me, when I started college, that one word was Eastern Europe or Russia. And I wanted to learn about that part of the world, not knowing whether I was going to go into business, law, diplomacy. Academia was at the bottom of the list, quite frankly, when I was starting college, trying to learn Russian. And the more I got into working, undertaking research, and organizing events, conferences, meeting with people in the former Soviet Union, the more I wanted to understand, why was this going on? Where was it taking us? What would these countries look like in a decade or two? Would they be able to consolidate democracy? Would their economies begin to turn around? And so these deeper why questions pulled me back to university. I also can say at the same time, I applied for a PhD at the end of my first year when I was working in the field in Kiev, and I deferred that and reapplied the following year as well. And I recognized that of the people working in foreign assistance, foreign development, international programs who are based in the former Soviet Union, and Eastern Europe, they seem to sort of, after a while, go from one country to another country. And I began to realize if I didn't go back to school, if I didn't go back to the US after 2 years, I probably would never go back. And so I felt as if 2 years was enough time to get a strong taste of what was going on in Ukraine and in the former Soviet Union. My project actually was based in Kyiv, but was for the entire part of the former Soviet Union, with the exception of the Baltic states. So I was working in Georgia, in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and other places as well during those 2 years. So I got a great sense of what was going on and recognized this was a very challenging transition being undertaken in that part of the world.
So from what you're saying, I'm getting that quite early on in your career, you realized that your interest goes much far beyond sort of the professional experience that you were getting. But I would be curious to know how did this experience sort of inform your research later on? Were you able to use some of the experience that you gained at Freedom House?
I would say probably the entirety of the experience I was able to use one way or another. I had experience working and living on my own in the former Soviet Union. I had to work with people in and out of government, non-governmental organizations, as well as government officials. That provided me access to things, as well as, we did this small program that I directed. We had a series of books that we published in at least 2 languages. We had a newsletter coming out every quarter in 3 languages. And I had to give out some small grants in different countries that, after going through a process of deciding who would be the best recipients to carry on rule of law work with USAID funding through our project. And I have to say, there were a lot. The fundamental thing I think that is really important for a lot of people to have prior to entering graduate school, and by that I mean PhD programs, is that they have a sense as to what the real world is like. What is it like to work for an organization with all of its bureaucratic and administrative components? What is it like to write a memo to your boss, summarizing them in less than a page what exactly is going on, or what are the options for you to take in the next stage of a project? These types of interactions of what it's really like to work, I would say, outside academia, I view as being very critical and important for most academics to have an understanding of before they go get the PhD, not only because they have an understanding of what they like and don't like about the non-academic world, but also it will enable them to sort of be able to work in academia, where we do juggle a variety of different balls at the same time and work in a variety of different contexts. We're not just sitting at our desk writing. We are trying to get interviews. We're trying to get access. We're trying to negotiate contracts to carry out our research. We're filing grant applications. We're teaching. There's a variety of activities that we do that are sort of beyond just sort of desk research. And I think that getting a taste of what the real world is like can help with that. Furthermore, I also saw when I was in graduate school a number of students who came straight through from their undergraduate programs. They were pushed into graduate school by, or they felt a little bit pushed by their undergraduate advisors, who recognized them as being brilliant, bright students who would do extremely well in a PhD program, but they had no other sort of taste for what else was out there in the world. So when they're in their first or second year of graduate school, starting the PhD program, they're not so sure or confident as to what they're doing is really the best thing for them.
Would you say a piece of advice for people who are considering that would be to indeed go and work for a bit before they want to come back into academia?
Absolutely. I think time off for a variety of reasons is good. Go get your feet wet. You may find that you don't like what you study after being in a certain part of the world. You may find as if what you imagined or dream or idealized to be, especially if you're studying politics or social or sociological aspects of different countries, you may find that it's just not for you, or that your sort of dreams about working there are not the same. So it's a win-win. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that people go off and work 5-10 years before they start graduate school, but that's certainly welcome. But I am suggesting just 1 or 2 years of getting out there and recognizing what other things there are out in the world, and also learning the sort of aspects of what it's like to work in a non-academic environment.
That's really interesting. I think it's curious how we're getting such different experiences from some of our students that we're talking to in the podcast, who some of them have gone into the PhD straight away. Some of them have had professional experience in between, and it sounds very, it almost seems individual, down to whatever people are experiencing. But it's really interesting to get that take from you. Thank you for that. And the next question I would like to ask you is, what do you value most about working in academia, especially now that you have that comparison?
I can't say I always balance all the balls correctly and appropriately to what my goals are. My goals are multifaceted, I suppose. I want to learn and understand what makes change happen, what causes things to take place, both from an academic intellectual point of view, but also in terms of being able to advise or provide some insight to those out there in the real world who are trying to make a difference. Ukraine, which is a major part of my work and has been for, since the mid-90s, actually, has had a long struggle trying to establish the rule of law within its borders, and trying to understand what works and what doesn't work will be a benefit to all those actors there who want to make a difference.
Absolutely. It sounds like a really good note to end, a very optimistic lookout for the future. So thank you very much, Marc, for joining us in the podcast. And now it's time for part 2.
Okay, and welcome back everyone to part 2. In the first half there, Anri spoke to us about her project and her research. And in the second half now, we're going to look more at her personal experience of the PhD. And taking it away is Tomek.
So Anri, could you tell us now what attracted you to the PhD program?
That's a good question. So I think it's a number of things. So before the PhD, I was working in law for 2 years. And I realized that I wasn't very interested in the law. I was interested in policy. And then at the same time, I decided to do a master's in public policy. And that's when I realized that I was interested in policy, but I was also really interested in the methods used to answer policy questions. So to look at whether a policy actually does what it set out to do, and that, you know, the result wasn't spurious. There wasn't two things going on at the same time, which means that the policy happened at the same time as this thing happening anyway. So even without the policy, the desired outcome would have been achieved. So because I really liked econometric methods and I was really interested in policy, and I had all these questions that I wanted to answer, I decided to do a PhD because that combined my love for policy analysis and methods, but also meant that I was able to tailor, you know, what kind of questions I would be answering given the methods.
And then why did you choose to go to Kingston for the program?
So I chose to go to King's because it was a really good match with my supervisor. And I think that's something that's not highlighted enough when people apply for PhDs. I think people apply to institutions, but you know, having a really good working relationship with your supervisor is really vital. And one of the key components of that is having similar research interests, but also similar approaches to answering the question. So a question like, does trade improve women's empowerment at the household level, can be answered by sociologists, it could be answered by economists, it could be answered by, you know, a lot of people. But my supervisor likes natural experiments, and so do I. And that's why, and he knows a lot about trade as well. He's a very good trade and development economist, which is the field I kind of sit in between. So there was a very good match, and that's why I chose to go to King's.
And I was wondering, because I've heard this also when we were chatting to people before, that sort of very sentence that you should apply to people, not institutions. And I was wondering, how do you go about looking for these people? Because as someone who is also considering this career path, I always thought, you know, you've got institutions where you are likely to find people that will match your interests, but maybe there is a smarter way to go about looking for these people.
So how you would know that is simply by reading their bio on their website, and reading the bio on the King's or whatever university's website, and also looking at the articles that they write. So that's a really good indication of what their research interests are. The good thing about academia is that you pursue projects that you like. You rarely pursue projects you don't like. So all the output by your potential supervisors are their research interests, are things that they have chosen to do, and the methods they use are methods that they have chosen to take. So it's a really good indication of whether your research and your methods align with your supervisors.
Anri, how is the PhD process different to what you expected? I mean, maybe it's the same to what you expected, but I wonder if it's confounded your expectations or it's been wildly different.
The main thing that's really stood out to me was how social everyone is. And I wasn't expecting that starting the PhD at all. I've read a lot about how solitary the PhD process is, how isolating it is because you're not working as part of a group, it's your own work. But I've been really pleasantly surprised by how social it is. And I think weirdly, how isolating it is means that people probably are more social than they usually will be because of the process. Because I think we all kind of realize that, yeah, you probably need to rely on each other for social interactions a bit more.
That's very encouraging. It sounds like people are just making an effort, knowing that this is the common knowledge, how, how alone of a journey it can be, but it's good to hear that you guys are supporting each other in this sense. We were wondering as well, so what would be something that helped you during the process? Maybe there was someone who shaped it in a certain way, or a certain piece of data or information that helped you, change it.
The thing that helped me massively was presenting my work at workshops and conferences, because that's the only time I really get outsider opinion on my work, apart from my supervisors. It's when you get a room full of people and a room full of comments, and because your supervisor knows your work so well and you know your work so well, that you start to take certain things as a given. And it's only when you presented them at conferences do you realize that, some things could be interpreted differently by other people, or things that you've completely missed out on explaining because it's so ingrained in you already that you didn't think it should be explained. And when you explain it to an audience and they say, can you explain that further, that's kind of a good indication of what you're under explaining in your own work as well. So I found that to be really, really useful.
And is that something that happens within the department here at King's, or are these conferences also outside?
So there are conferences and workshops hosted by academics at King's, but there are also conferences that you can apply to, and they're usually in quite nice places like Florence and Barcelona, and you can apply for funding to go to these conferences as well.
So would you say that you pick the nicest locations for conferences, or?
I would say that they're a factor, but not the only factor.
It's just pure coincidence if it's in Hawaii, is it?
It's pure coincidence.
What are the challenges of the PhD process as it sort of relates to your experience?
I think a key challenge is, having to be flexible with timeline. I think the key requirement of a PhD is that you make a contribution to the literature, and I think having to justify why you are doing what you're doing on a daily basis, whether you truly are contributing to the literature or not, is really difficult and requires lots of flexibility in terms of timeline, because the contribution could be methodological, but it could also be what you're finding. And like I said, a lot of it is data cleaning, and when you're doing data cleaning, you're not contributing to the literature. And then once you've cleaned the data and you're applying your model, you have to then justify why you're using the model you're using. And I think being flexible with your timeline and how that relates to contributing to the literature is that it gives you time to dig into your data and see, in my case anyway, see if there are certain outcomes that haven't been looked at by other papers, seeing certain heterogeneous effects that weren't explored by other papers, and that takes a long time, and you only come to that by really inspecting your data and seeing whether there is an effect or not.
How do you overcome the challenge of facing 6 months worth of data cleaning? I mean, you may not go into that process knowing it's going to take 6 months, but presumably it's going to be quite a lengthy and laborious process. What helps you overcome that challenge?
What's really important is to break up the monotony of that. So whether that's downloading lots of articles and then reading that as something different to do. I found that teaching also really helps with breaking up that monotony, so that I'm not just cleaning data, I'm also able to teach and to run seminars. So I think really it's about trying to have a variety of tasks, but also I think what's really important is just being really honest with yourself and saying it has to be done.
And you mentioned you also teach seminars. How do you find that? Do you feel like this is something you would want to continue doing? So would you want to stay in academia and teach, or are you planning to take your PhD back into professional career, if you will?
I would love to pursue academia, and that's part of the reason why I pursued a PhD in the first place. It wasn't just to get a PhD, it was also as part of a plan to pursue academia. And luckily doing a PhD hasn't put me off doing academia, which I know it sometimes does. And that's fine. But I also really like teaching. I think you're able to interact with other academics. You're not necessarily always teaching for your supervisors. It's a good way of interacting with other academics. I also like teaching because I think it kind of reiterates my knowledge for certain things. When I was learning quantitative methods, a lot of the assumptions were just given to me. I think as a teacher, you kind of have to relearn that, but also with the hindsight of why it is important, so you're able to convey that to students, which I've been really enjoying. And also it breaks up the monotony of just sitting at the desk and staring at a screen as well. It's much more interactive.
And I was wondering, if you don't mind me asking, do you rely on funding here, or are you self-funded PhD student?
Yeah, so I have various sources of funding. So I'm funded by the FCDO, and that gives me that covers my my fees and gives me a small stipend. But it's not really enough to live in London, so I also teach. And I'm also partially self-funded, so I have various streams. But I think in terms of buying data, I've had to apply within the department for that sort of funding.
It's good that there are these opportunities for these extra research costs that, as we talked in the beginning, you might have not expected when you went into that.
Yeah. I didn't realize at all how expensive data was going to be. So the data for my second chapter costed about $7,000, and luckily me and my supervisor were able to get a grant, some funding to buy that data. But yeah, it can be incredibly prohibitive to get really, really good data. But the pitfall of data is if you use bad data, you usually don't publish very well. If you use good quality data, that means that your findings are at least credible, and then that increases your chance of getting published. So, yeah.
What would your advice be to someone who's thinking about applying for a PhD? What would you say is the most important thing they need to think ahead about, perhaps?
I think my advice would be to have a very specific research question going in. So I didn't follow my own advice 3 years ago, which and the question I had was very broad. It was, did trade reduce poverty? And I motivated it in different ways, but I think with a PhD you need a very specific question, and I think having a very specific question also allows you to refine what you read much quicker. And also it means that you spend less time going down, different rabbit holes. And I'm sure going down different rabbit holes can be very enriching. but sometimes you take too long to pursue one project. Or you pursue that project a bit aimlessly. But I think if you have a very specific question that you want to answer, that really helps speed up the process.
Would you say it's good to build on perhaps the work that you would have done as a master's student?
I would say that's not necessarily necessary at all, but if that's something you enjoyed, then I think you could build on it. But I don't think that's a necessary requirement. I think in terms of how you come to a identifying a specific question you want to answer. You can do that throughout your master's by looking at the reading list, and I think you can work out from there what your preferences are, what your preferences aren't. And through going through the reading list, you can kind of realize what questions have been answered, how they've answered it, and what your contribution can be.
The last question, Anri, what is the PhD community like at King's?
It is great. For all my friends listening, you are great.
Are they a source of support? When we spoke to other PhD candidates, they said that the social aspect is great, but it can be difficult because they're all working on very individual projects that nobody else can really help with. Does that sort of reflect your experience?
So yeah, I think in terms of getting support from my colleagues, it's not so much content because I rely on my supervisors for that. I think my friends have actually helped me with coding issues that have come across. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to help them as much as they have helped me where that's concerned. But I think mainly it's just the collegiality of the office, having that motivation to go in, and not feeling, feeling a bit, when you're feeling a bit down about the outcomes that you have. It's quite nice to realize that people have felt like that in the past, and that it was a small part of their PhD, their entire PhD process, and that it's not the only thing they felt.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Well, I think that brings an end to today's episode. So I would like to thank my co-host for today, Tomek, for his support. And I would like to thank Anri for sharing her thoughts and insights for the episode. Of course, thanks also to you, our listeners, for taking the time to tune in. And we look forward to welcoming you again soon for our next episode. Take care.